Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is a humid day here in suburban Chicago. It looks like it's going to be a hot one. There's a bunny running by. And so I'm taking my walk relatively early in the day. It's not even 9 a.m. yet. It's already pretty roasty. So look out for that if you're in the Chicago area. Well, today I thought I would talk a little bit about some news I've heard that is really interesting. And so I wanted to engage with it a little bit. This is an episode of Culture and Games, returning to the question of colonialism. Now, I think I've said all I need to say about that subject generally, but there's been some really interesting developments that I've heard about on a couple of podcasts. They mentioned it on Blue Peg, Pink Peg. They mentioned it on So Very Wrong About Games. And I think they mentioned it over on Board Game Barrage, although I may be wrong about that third one. In any case, what we're seeing is a shift in the cover or the discussion about colonialism in board games from perspective of designers. In particular, one prominent designer who has, I think, made some not great choices in the last couple years about this subject seems to have undergone a shift in what he's saying about this, and that's Alexander Pfister. So, the news that I heard comes first out of a conversation about the game Boon Lake, which is due out Q4 of this year from DLP Games, and this is a Alexander Pfister exploration colonialism type game. It's rated as a difficulty 4.0, so it's gonna be nice and juicy, and it might be the first Alexander Pfister game I pick up in a long time, and the first of his complex games because they weren't about colonialism. Now, it is still sort of about colonialism, but here's the trick. It's a new place. The premise is there's this long lost island that people learned about. Some people used to live there a long time ago, but now it's deserted. There are no people there. So you and other people are going to go see what's there and settle the land. Okay, so they made up a new place called Boon Lake, and then that's the setting. In addition, I've heard from, I think on Blue Peg, Pink Peg, they mentioned that Alexander Pfister has announced that he is re-theming Mombasa, to not be about the colonization or the exploitation of Africa, and instead be, I don't know what, something else. Again, great news. The third piece of news that I wanted to share was that, and I guess this isn't, well, okay, on Shelf Stories, which is a channel about difficult or complex topics in board games, the host there, whose name is eluding me right now, has talked quite a bit about Puerto Rico as a game that is troublesome for many reasons. And he mentioned on his site that Alia, I think, or Lookout, whoever produces that game, is working with the designer on a new edition of Puerto Rico that will address these issues much more directly. And in order to do that, they are working with a team of cultural consultants so that the new version of Puerto Rico is sensitive to the people who live in Puerto Rico, and it's not about the exploitation of them. That's really exciting to me. It shows a sense of growth and optimism in the market that I feel like I'm really going to have to support with my money. I've always heard how good Puerto Rico is. I've never played it because I found the theme pretty gross. But I mean, if they come out with a new edition that's specifically designed to address these issues and created, I might have to buy it just because, even if I didn't want to play it, just to put my money where my mouth is, to tell game producers this is important to us. Really fascinating. Although I do want to buy it. I've always thought it sounded like a fun game, and now that it isn't gross. Anyway, so I don't know when that one's due out. Boon Lake is due out Q4. So what I wanted to talk about today is this idea of how board game creators can or should be addressing these issues of colonialism that have haunted the genre or the medium for a while. And I had a couple examples and a couple solutions. I have 4 different solutions, and I'll slot in the examples that we've talked about already as well as some others. All right, so here we go. So the first solution we've already talked about, and this is the non-specific present. right? If you want to make a game that uses these mechanisms and builds on these ideas, but you don't want to frame it in the real world, which carries with it a lot of baggage about people who were exploited and or murdered, whose lands were stolen by the colonizers, then one way to do that is to create in your narrative a place that people can go to settle that there aren't people, right? Terraforming Mars does this. On Mars does this by having us go to space. On Earth, the board game that many people cite as their entry into the hobby, Settlers of Catan, or Catan, does this, right? Catan isn't a place that's populated by people, at least not in the narrative of the game. And now we have Boone Lake from Alexander Pfister. In all these situations, the problem of real-world colonialism and the problem of individuals whose personal histories are connected to that, or the problem of people who don't want to have to address that or think about that in their gaming, the problem is dodged by using a non-specific present or non-specific past, a place that doesn't exist. Similarly, there's an idea of a fantasy environment, right? Which is similar to the non-specific one, but often just shifts the genre into other genres, right? So, like I said, Terraforming Mars or On Mars, those are both sort of hard sci-fi. But then you have something like Alexander Pfister's last game, which was sort of more in the medium weight, or so I understand, and that's Cloud Age. And in Cloud Age, you're flying around in a Zeppelin, and it's after the environmental apocalypse, and you're not engaging with people in that way. Or like Martin Wallace's Via Nebula is a good example of taking the train genre, which generally we don't talk too much about the abuses of the train barons, but there certainly were some. And he shifts the train game into this fantasy landscape where you no longer have to worry about people's towns being destroyed by land speculators or unscrupulous labor practices involved in building the railroads. And instead it's this fantasy world. And so, again, you're able to avoid talking about those questions by engaging with this theme in another way. And I think 90% of the time, that's the way to go, right? That if you want to make a game that's about building civilization or building a society, doing that sort of thing, which is the fun way to go, because if you want to engage with building a society, that's the fun way to go, because there's a lot of fun things about setting up a structure and building a society. Then you get to have the fun of that sort of management style game without the cultural baggage. But I think there are other solutions that help us even more, right? So that pushes the games into escapism by evading the questions that you might have to ask. So what if instead you engaged with the history in a deeper way, right? And this is by far the most challenging, I think. And this would be what the makers of Puerto Rico are trying to do, and what other game designers have tried to do in the past, to varying effect, right? The Freedom, the Underground Railroad does that by enacting a narrative where the history emerges through the mechanisms, but the game itself is built around a careful and respectful engagement with the historical situation. Other designers have wrestled with this issue in other ways. Martin Wallace, for instance, in designing London, built in this mechanism of poverty cubes, and the idea that if you are managing your city in the wrong way, then you accumulate poverty, which is a blight on your ability to do well, right? So the game punishes you if you're not actively working to reduce poverty in your city. Now, the game doesn't really say what you're doing when you reduce poverty, right? The method of like shooing away poor people, which is apparently something that's happening in some cities now, where they'll bribe people to get on a one-way bus to another city to get rid of homeless people, as horrifying as that sounds, is fine. Or that part is bad, obviously, but having a game that engages with the question is better than a game that ignores it, right? And a game that has demands that you as a player think about how to do this really is an issue. It's a fantasy world, but Dungeon Pets, for instance, right? It has animals that poop all over the cages, and the animals can get sick if you aren't actively managing that poop. So the idea of like keeping the animals clean is a key part of the game. And if you aren't attending to the needs of the animals, then they get sick or they get sad, and sadness cubes affect their salability, right? So the game punishes you again. If you're keeping sad animals, you're not keeping them happy, then the game punishes you. But so I think one thing that it would be excellent to see game designers do is engage more directly with the history of the genre. Now, this is something I'm wrestling with a little bit. One of the game designs I've been tinkering with for a while now is about early Hollywood. And I think there's some really interesting stuff to be done with the confluence of building a studio, managing your studio staff, creating films that hit the market at the right time and engage the audience and all of that. And then using film technology to sort of do that better or whatever. But there's also a lot of social political stuff in the history of Hollywood, and I haven't yet figured out how to deal with that issue. You know, the fact that when Hollywood went from silent film to sound, women were effectively boxed out of doing film work, or the way that white supremacists would block out significant African American film producers from doing work in the genre. Those are things to think about, how much I want to express that in the game and how much I want to say, this is something that happened, but in our game, we're going to pretend it didn't. Which brings me to the last option here, other than engaging with real history, is the alternate history, in which you imagine a world where these things didn't happen. And I think there's a fine line here, right? You know, a game about colonialism where you just imagine that the people living in the place you go to weren't exploited is grim. At the same time, maybe there's potential for a different kind of thinking, because one of the big things about colonialism in games is not just the exploitation of the people where you're going, it's the mindset of the colonialist. The idea that I bring my stuff to this other place and I declare it unowned and free to take, and then I take, right? There's a very capitalist approach to managing the world. And there's a reason capitalism is attractive and the reason it's fun, and so those games work to let you be the capitalist, but they don't really engage with these bigger questions of culture. One of the games that's getting a lot of buzz right now, which I did pre-order, is Anno 1800. This is a new Martin Wallace title. And this game is interesting because at the heart of the game is the idea that you are building settlements focused on making people happy, the people in your purview, including the people who lived there to begin with. Right? The idea is that you are building trade and economy, and you're not going into a place you didn't already live. You are working within the place you live to make your people happy. And I'm interested to see how the game engages with this bigger question, and whether the mechanisms actually live up to that, or whether it's just, you know, pretty paint on an otherwise standard colonialist game. So I'm excited to see how that happens. You know, Martin Wallace is kind of hit or miss. Some of his games are really great. Some of them need tuning, or they're idiosyncratic to the point of not being super fun, but they're weird and they're interesting. And so I'm keen to see how that will emerge. But I think at the heart of it, if the verb in that game is cooperate, which apparently there's a big part of it where you are using other people's markets, which has been a big thing of Wallace's games, right? That happens in Brass. That element is really interesting, and I like it in a way that, you know, a lot of other games don't adequately portray. So I'm curious, what do you think about the recent developments in the conversation about colonialism in games? How do you think you are going to engage, if at all, with these questions? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let me know. You can reach me, Brendan, at Rattlebox Games by email, or Wombat929 is my Board Game Geek username. I hope to hear from you soon. Thanks for listening. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.